right. It always goes live just a few moments before I think that it is live. So, let's see. Yeah, okay. So it says it's been live for 5 seconds. I always am surprised by what little weird things get put in the video. Like before noonday prayer, I was trying to fix the poofiness of my hair, which is just a lost cause. Coronavirus hair is just affecting us all. Um, so, alas, as I was saying to a group of our young adults last night, um, we're probably like, I don't know, a week out or 2 weeks out max from a true test of Carly and I's marriage, which will be Carly needing to somehow try to cut my hair. So keep that in your prayers. We'll see how it goes. I at least made it to Easter without anything terrible happening, so we'll see. Um, all right, well, it's 2:01, so let's go ahead and begin today's session, which is session 5. I need to pull up my notes here. I don't like having them cover up my face too much, so I can kind of see what's going on in the comments. All right, so welcome. Thanks for tuning in, y'all. It is always good to join with you. I see Emily saying that Carly won't cut my hair. I believe it will happen because I can't see it all. I can't do it. I've got trimmers. We're going to have to figure it out. It's teamwork makes the dream work in marriage as in life. So we'll see how it goes. All right. As always, my notes for this session will be posted on my personal website at CameronandSurplus.com. They're not up there yet, but they will be later today. I've got today's, in order to keep this less than 45 minutes, I had a lot of notes to cut today. So I've got to edit those a little bit more, and then I'll convert those to PDF and post those for you. So those will be available. I also engage with any questions that y'all post in the comments. Would be happy to answer anything there. Yeah. So, all right. Before we jump in today to talk about today's session, session 5 is about the arrest, trial, and crucifixion of Jesus. And this is really where everything comes to a head in the Gospel of John. But before we get there, I want to clarify something about last week's session on the farewell discourse and the Last Supper. So this was a little clearer in my notes, but I realized when I went back and listened to my session later, I didn't really make this clear in the video last week, and so wanted to clarify that the farewell discourse refers specifically to the words that Jesus gives, the speech that Jesus gives at the Last Supper to his disciples. But the entirety of the Last Supper, from the foot washing through the farewell discourse and the prayers that Jesus prays for his disciples at the end, are the farewell, the larger farewell, right, that he's giving to his disciples at the Last Supper. I think it's, to look at only the farewell discourse in isolation is not super helpful, because I think the whole thing, Jesus washing his disciples' feet and the example that he gives there, and the prayers that he prays at the end, I think all of that is crucial to understanding what Jesus wants to leave his followers as the most important things, including the commandment to love one another as I have loved you, all that sort of stuff. And so I didn't really clarify that distinction very well last week. Adam Hamilton in the book, oops, I'm bringing a bunch of pages with me. Adam Hamilton in the book doesn't really make that distinction either, and so I just kind of blazed through it last week, but wanted to clarify. Anyway, and it was in the notes. If you look at the notes, it's a little clearer there, but it wasn't clear in my video, so I apologize for that. All right, so over the course of this study, which is now, again, on week 5, amazingly, we have discussed how John differs in content and composition from the other 3 Gospels, and how these differences help us to better understand Jesus and his ministry. Remembering that John is devotional in character and is meant to inspire belief in Jesus so that we might have life in his name. We have talked about that so much through each of these sessions, but I bring it up again because a lot of what we'll talk about today is the significance of the differences, especially in this narrative of Jesus' crucifixion. John's does some different things from the Synoptic Gospels, and they're really important for us to consider. So I wanted to mention that again today, just as a reminder. We've also explored the 7 signs that Jesus performs in John's Gospel and their rich symbolism that give us a window into the kingdom of God and what God seeks to accomplish through Jesus. Some scholars talk about Jesus on the cross as the seventh sign. We referenced that back a few weeks ago, but just to remind you of that as well. So keep that in mind as we look through these chapters today. Then we also talked about the 7 I am sayings of Jesus in John's Gospel. We looked at how each of these sayings illuminates a new and exciting aspect of God's nature and character, and we talked about the relationship between Moses and Jesus. We're going to talk more about that relationship today, and the name, the divine name, I am, factors into today's portion of the gospel as well. So again, all of these themes that John has been setting up for us, the themes of light and life and all of that sort of stuff that we've sort of seen throughout the gospel, are all going to be on display in this section today. And then, of course, finally, we talked about the Last Supper last week and Jesus' final speech to his disciples, which, as I said, is a farewell discourse. We looked at how Jesus' final instructions to his followers, the culmination of his mission, ministry, and teachings, all boil down to 4 lessons and assurances revolving around the divine command to love one another as God loves us. So go back and look at that from last week if you hadn't already. Now, today's passage, the chapters that we'll be looking at today, immediately follow what we talked about last week. And again, as I've said from the start, John's gospel is all about the cross, all about the cross. And finally, we are here. We are at that moment, okay? Fully half the Gospel of John is related to the cross, the passion narrative, the crucifixion itself, the resurrection. That's half of John's Gospel, which clearly indicates to us that for John it is central and it is crucial. John also includes a lot of detail, very specific detail, which we'll talk about, that is not in some of the other Gospels. For John, this is the moment when Jesus' true identity and glory are revealed, is on the cross. Jesus, as the King of Heaven, is crowned in thorns and enthroned on the cross, and this is how the redemption of the world comes into being, through this self-sacrificial act of Jesus that demonstrates that there is truly nothing, not even death itself, that can separate us from the love of God. Okay, and that is really what this is about for John, and what we're going to talk about. That God is demonstrating that this is what it looks like. This is what His kingdom looks like. That this is what how much He cares about us. We see in John's depiction of these events some of the ways, again, as I mentioned, that his gospel differs from the synoptics. And I want to say the differences here, a lot of people will look at that and say, well, the timeline of things is different, some of the details are different, and they might see that as a mistake. But I hope by this point, as we've walked through John's gospel for these 5 weeks, you'll know not to think, like, John's not making mistakes when he's kind of changing things around. They're not mistakes, they're intentional authorial choices that are meant to help us understand something special and specific about Jesus. Okay, it's not just like Matthew, Mark, and Luke got it right and John gets it wrong necessarily. That's not really what John's about. And I think that's to impose modern categories of truth and fact and all of that sort of stuff onto an ancient document that's not meant to be reporting in the way that we think of it. And so don't look at the differences here as mistakes. It's theology. That's what John's doing. John is doing theology for us, helping us see these things about who God is and who Jesus is. All right. So, okay. Yes. So let's dive in. There are 2 major themes in this section. Okay. So that's the context. Everything we just talked about is the context for today's reading. The 2 major themes that we see in this section are themes of the Passover. So again, we're going to see a lot of Moses stuff again, lots of stuff from the Exodus. That's the first theme. And the second theme, which is related to it, is the kingship of Jesus. Okay. Those are the 2 themes that are woven through this section. Now, I've arranged this into sections corresponding chronologically to the events that are going on. So we have the arrest of Jesus, we've got the trial, and then, well, really trials, plural, if you want to look at it that way, and then the crucifixion itself. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to walk through each of those events one at a time. So the arrest. So after the Last Supper, probably about midnight, Jesus and the disciples leave the upper room and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, and already, right off the bat today, we see the ways in which John's account of these events is different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, because in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, uh, Jesus is really anxious and is in agony. Now, when we, backing up just a little bit, when we think of the events of Jesus's life in our heads, we usually unintentionally make this composite gospel in our heads. We do this all the time with Christmas, right? So, like, Mark doesn't even have an infancy narrative, and then the infancy narrative that we think of as the Christmas story is kind of this mashup of both Luke and Matthew, right? Like, that's kind of what we think of when we think about Christmas. I think we do the same thing with Jesus' passion, where we think of all of these different details mentioned in each gospel and we kind of push them together into this composite gospel in our minds of how it went. Well, um, when we think of this moment of Jesus praying in the garden, we often think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I don't really think that we envision John's portrayal, and that's because when I think of Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think of him in agony. Right? He prays that the cup will pass from him, that he doesn't have to do this. Um, Mark, and Matthew's accounts very similar. Luke ups the ante even further and says that Jesus is so in agony that his sweat is dripping like blood, okay, onto the ground. I mean, Jesus is just so upset about this, and understandably so. But in John, we get a very different picture. Okay, in John 18, and I would in my notes I actually reference the specific passages if you want to go back and read and compare. But John 18 is where Jesus goes to pray in the garden in the Gospel of John, and John's Jesus is much more stoic. He's like on top of all of this. We don't get any indication that he's anxious. He's not grieving. He's not mournful. He doesn't ask that the cup pass from him. Instead, it seems like Jesus in the Gospel of John knows what he's going to do and the task that lies before him, and he is determined to do it. Okay, he's fulfilling his destiny really. Um, I think it's also important to notice how many soldiers come to arrest Jesus in John's gospel. In John 18, verse 3, John tells us that a quote, detachment, which is what the NRSV says, the Common English Bible uses the word cohort, but a detachment of soldiers came with Judas to arrest Jesus. Now, detachment is an actual amount of soldiers, and it ranged anywhere from like 200 to 600 soldiers. Okay, a detachment was a lot of people. It was basically a small army. Okay, and again, I don't think we think about that when we think about this scene. We think of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is a much smaller band of guards that come to arrest Jesus. But in John, it's an army that comes to get Jesus. Okay, which I think again is meant to emphasize Jesus's imposing character as King of the Jews and his significance in this way, and how formidable he is as the Son of God. He needs a whole army to come and arrest him. There's also this interesting scene where they ask, which one is Jesus, and Jesus says, "I am." He's just saying, like, I'm Jesus, I'm the one you're looking for. But again, it's that divine name. And John tells us that when Jesus says that, the soldiers shrink back at the mention of the name, which is really interesting. Again, very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So John is really trying to get us already to think about that this is the King of Heaven, right? This is emphasizing Jesus's divine nature as opposed to his human one, which is what we talked about in session 1. So Jesus here again is a divine figure who is marching triumphantly to fulfill his destiny and his mission. And we'll continue to see that throughout John's portrayal. So then after this is the trial. Okay, so Jesus is brought in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin, which was like the Jewish council, the Jewish court. And but in John, though, he's not brought before the Sanhedrin. He is brought before Annas and Caiaphas. Annas being the former high priest and Caiaphas being the current high priest. And this emphasizes that John wants us to see Jesus' threat to the Jewish authority and leadership. I think that that again, Jesus is the great high priest. Okay, and this is leadership that would have been more closely allied with Rome, because the Sadducees, the priestly class, were often aristocrats who were much friendlier with Rome and with Roman occupation of their land. And so I think there's a number of layers there. Remember, John loves layers. John loves the layering of meaning. So Annas and Caiaphas, and there's a whole scene there. There's some discourse, and they bind Jesus and they send him to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. The high priest had claimed that Jesus, because of his claims to be the king of the Jews, should be charged with insurrection against the emperor. And that's important because insurrection against the emperor was a crime punishable by death. And so this is where we get Pontius Pilate's dialogue with Jesus, where they're talking and he's kind of interrogating Jesus. And this theme of kingship ends up being a lot of what Pilate asks Jesus about. This is where Jesus talks about his kingdom not being from this world, which emphasizes that here Jesus is not. It's not that Jesus is king of the Jews. That's like they're misunderstanding it. Jesus is king of the universe, right? Of everybody. And so we see this again. One of those two themes. Passover was the first theme, and the second theme was the kingship of Jesus. And we're seeing that one here. In a sense, this is not really a trial of Jesus. This scene with with Jesus and Pilate, it's really a trial of Pilate, if you think about it, right? That he sees no reason to condemn Jesus to death, but he's faced with this choice: either he follows Jesus, or he follows the crowds. Now we all know what happens, right? He caves and he hands Jesus over to die, and he washes his hands of the whole thing. Okay, and I think that John, as a devotional gospel, is getting us to think about ourselves as Pilate, faced with this same choice, and what choice will we make here? I think that's an important question that John wants us to ponder. Now, before we continue on, I want to pause just a little bit and reflect on something that I think is really important. It's kind of a bit of an aside, but is an important thing to talk about when you talk about the Gospel of John. I mentioned this a little bit in session 1 about the ways in which the context of the composition of John has meant that it's given credence, unfortunately, in certain times of the church's life to a kind of anti-Semitism that I think we need to be very careful about and very critical about as modern readers. And it has to do a lot with this part of the gospel. And that's because John refers to, quote, the Jews here in a lot of this portion of Jesus' crucifixion. And he means it in a derogatory sense, right? They're the ones who choose Barabbas to go free instead of Jesus. And this has, as I said, unfortunately led to strains of anti-Semitism in the church, especially in the medieval period. This was really big, but it's been throughout the church's history, sadly, that this idea that it's the Jews who killed Jesus. Okay, now I think we need to stop and think about that for a second, because it's not only unfortunate, but it's also incorrect. It's an incorrect trope, right? Because it's the Romans who crucified Jesus, and it's not the Jews who crucified Jesus, because Jesus is a Jew. His followers are Jewish. And also we think about Nicodemus, who himself was a Jewish leader. He was a Pharisee, and Nicodemus is who we've mentioned in previous sessions, actually goes and brings stuff to anoint Jesus' body after he dies. So it's not the Jews writ large that demand that Jesus die. It is a subsection of Jews. And the example that Adam Hamilton uses in his book, which I think is helpful for us, is, we would never say somehow that the KKK is representative of Christianity writ large, right? Even though they claimed for themselves to be Christians. And we kind of have to think about this in a similar way, and not create a mistake where we in an attempt to be like faithful to the text, we actually perpetuate and commit a sin that in fact makes us unfaithful to the Lord and his commandments to love one another, right? By saying, well, the Jews killed Jesus. Well, no, they didn't really. Anyway, and I think that's just important for us to consider, because again, we can end up perpetuating certain ways of thinking about others that actually are antithetical to the very thing that Jesus taught his own followers just in the chapter before. So anyway, it's a little bit of an aside, but it really is important to talk about given the place of this passages and the way that it's been used throughout Christian history. I just think we have to be careful about that. All right, so let's get back to the narrative itself. So Pilate hands him over to the people. And then, so anyway, okay, so then Jesus, he's whipped and he's flogged and he's meant to carry his cross up the mountain to be crucified. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus is carrying his cross, he has a lot of trouble carrying his cross. He really struggles to do it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And Simon of Cyrene steps in to help him, right? We're familiar with this story. But notice how in John, actually, that Jesus doesn't need help. John's kind of careful to say he did it on his own. He carried his cross by himself, which I think only emphasizes John's point, which we talked about before, that Jesus is in just total command of the situation. He is marching to his death, carrying his own means of execution. But again, this is to fulfill his mission, and he is doing it, and he's God incarnate. He doesn't need our help. He's going to do it for us. So this brings me to one of those themes that I mentioned at the beginning, which was the theme of the Passover. Earlier I talked about that there are two themes that run through this part of John's Gospel. One of those was the kingship of Jesus, and one of those is the Passover, the Feast of Passover. John is very careful in his Gospel to mention that as Jesus marches his cross up the mountain and is crucified, he says in John 19, chapter 14, or John chapter 19, verse 14, that it was about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover. Okay, now the reason that this is significant is because this timeline is different than the timeline that we see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus' crucifixion takes place on the first day after the first day of Passover, like after the day of preparation. Whereas John's timeline places Jesus' death at the same time that Jewish families would have been slaughtering their lambs for the Passover feast, which God had instructed Israel to do back in the book of Exodus, and we read about that in Exodus. So remember that in the book of Exodus, the Israelites in bondage in Egypt, they were to slaughter a lamb, each household, to slaughter a lamb, rub it down in bitter herbs and cook it, and then take some blood from the lamb and to smear the blood on their doorposts, okay, using a branch of hyssop. Now, the kind of branch is very important, and we'll get to that in just a second, okay, but remember the branch. And then again, you'll recall in Exodus, an angel of death passes over the homes with the lamb's blood and doesn't kill the firstborn. But the Egyptians, because they didn't spread the blood on their doors, are just devastated by this plague, and this is the thing that finally gets Pharaoh to relent and to let the Israelites go. Okay, and so following that night, God commands the Israelites to mark their deliverance with a meal, which becomes the Passover Seder. Now, this is very important because, again, this is when John, this is kind of what John wants you to have in mind. Is all of this is going on against, or Jesus' crucifixion is going on against the backdrop of the Passover. Okay. The other theme that I mentioned earlier, again, is the kingship of Jesus. And for John, the enthronement of King Jesus happens on the cross. And the Passover imagery and the kingship imagery kind of converge in this moment. So we'll come back to the Passover stuff, but let's talk about the king, the imagery of Jesus as the king. If you notice the language on the sign that's placed above Jesus' head, this is in John chapter 19 still, this is verse 19. The sign that's placed over Jesus' head says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Now, each crucified person would have had a sign placed above them that listed their crime, the crime that warranted their death. And this was Jesus' crime, that he was the King of the Jews. John also, again, details are super important in the Gospel of John. John tells us that the sign was written in not one language, but three languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. These three languages represent the languages spoken across the Hellenistic world. And so John is implicitly telling us here that this sign was proclaiming to the world, not just to, to Rome, or not just to the other Jews or whatever. It was proclaiming to the world that they knew, that Jesus was the king. So this is not just the king of the Jews, but the king of everyone. And there's this kind of literary irony here that it's actually the Roman sign justifying Jesus' crucifixion that's the first to proclaim him king. Um, Now, earlier I said, and here's where we start to see the Passover imagery converge with the kingship imagery. Earlier I said that the Jews were instructed in Exodus 12 to use a hyssop branch to wipe the lamb's blood across their doorposts. Okay, now once we get the language from the sign, we have this scene of Jesus. He's thirsty, and people put a sponge on a branch and dip it in sour wine, and they hold the branch up to Jesus's lips. Notice that John tells us what the branch is made of, and you can probably already guess where this is going. But John tells us that the soldiers, or the people who were there, used a hyssop branch to offer Jesus this sour wine. Now, this, I think, is John really wanting to drive home the point that Jesus is the Passover lamb that is slain for us, liberating us from death, again, saving us as from the angel of death. And I think we're definitely supposed to see some Eucharistic imagery here, that the wine, Jesus's blood, the hyssop branch, the wine, the blood being put on the doorpost. Anyway, there's a lot of layers here, and I don't want to go into them because I know this session I knew would go a little bit longer than I was planning, but anyway, so there's a lot to mine in these passages as you're reading them, just like the rest of the gospel has been. But I think we're really supposed to see, again, the convergence of this Exodus story and the divine kingship imagery converging in these moments of Jesus on the cross. But here's the thing, though, is the importance of the hyssop branch doesn't just stop with the Passover imagery. There's actually more to it even than that. In Leviticus chapter 14 and in Numbers chapter 19, we see that hyssop has an association with Jewish rites of purification, okay? We see this also in the Psalms. In Psalm 51, verse 7, the psalmist proclaims, "Purify me with hyssop, and I will be clean. Wash me, and I will be whiter than snow." Okay, so it's not just this allusion to Passover, it's also this allusion to being purified and being cleansed. All of that is going on here, and John is very carefully crafting this gospel so that we see all of those layers. So here we have it, right? Here we have it. Jesus on the cross, bearing our sin, showing us and demonstrating to us the ultimate example of selfish love. Remember, he's just told his disciples there is no greater love than you can have than for someone to lay down their life for their friends. And here he is doing that. He is taking upon himself the worst of humanity and demonstrating that none of the things that we can ever hope to do are stronger than God's love is for us. He is the Paschal Lamb. He is the light of the world, the one that darkness could not overcome. And John wants us to understand that all of these things are not only true, but they're converging in this moment where Jesus is our true King, to whom we have our allegiance above and beyond the powers and principalities of this world. That this is the true picture of God. He's not a God that comes rushing in with mighty armies to destroy his enemies, but actually who gives himself as a servant, liberating us from sin and redeeming us even though we don't deserve it. And this has been what John's gospel has been about the whole time. From the very beginning of the prologue until now, we see that all of the themes that John is setting up for us, like I said, converge in this one moment, and this incredible moment of Jesus on the cross, which is why in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus's famous words are, my God, why have you forsaken me?" In the Gospel of John, though, Jesus says, "It is finished." Not, "Why have you forsaken me?" but "It is finished." It is complete. It has been completed. My work here is done, basically. All of these things that I have come here to do have been accomplished in this moment, and it is finished. and that's when Jesus breathes his last. So that is Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. There is so much in this portion of John's Gospel. As always, go and read these chapters yourself. There's so much more to be gained and gotten out of them, especially, I mean, I could just spend a whole session just talking about Jesus' interactions with Pilate, for instance, which is such a rich and interesting dialogue. So there's a lot here. I would encourage y'all to read it in preparation for next week. Next week, we're going to talk about the resurrection. We're going to talk about the resurrected life and kind of conclude this study. And I'm really excited about that. I hope that you will join me for that. I have just really enjoyed doing these, and I hope y'all have as well and have gotten something out of them. So anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of this beautiful day. And again, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments or send them to me. I will be posting the notes later on this afternoon, and I look forward to joining you again next week at 2 p.m. As we talk about the resurrection. So happy Eastertide, everybody, and it was good to spend this afternoon with you.